At 3:04 a.m., the global energy supply chain reached a strategic inflection point as the Strait of Hormuz witnessed the initial phase of a calculated operational erasure. A convoy of supertankers was threading through the Middle East's narrowest shipping lane when every radar screen simultaneously flared red, dozens of high-speed signatures erupted just above the water's surface, hurtling toward the formation. This was no mere provocation. It was a sophisticated pincer maneuver executed by the IRGC, marking a rapid shift toward open maritime militarization. By 3:07 a.m., the assault intensified as Iranian suicide boats surged out from the coastline in dispersed formations. They accelerated directly toward the tankers from multiple directions at once, creating an immediate tactical crisis. To complicate the defensive picture, smaller drone boats skimmed the surface almost invisibly, utilizing the dense civilian shipping traffic as a moving shield to negate the coalition's technological edge. This represented a clear asymmetric advantage designed to force a doctrine crisis within the escort fleet. But while the surface, boiled with movement, the primary threat remained hidden beneath the waves. Deep within the narrow currents of the strait, Iranian Ghadir-class midget submarines shifted into a silent ambush posture. They were now sitting directly beneath the convoy lanes, invisible and waiting. With the convoy wrapped in the world's narrowest shipping lane and Iranian midget submarines successfully achieving ambush posture beneath the noise of civilian traffic, what critical failure in Western sensor technology is about to be exploited to turn this escort mission into a massacre? The vulnerability in Western maritime security is not a lack of firepower, but the inherent limitations of high-frequency radar when faced with extreme environmental noise. When hostile signatures deliberately mask their profiles within the chaotic return of crashing waves and heavy commercial hull signatures, the most advanced algorithms can suffer from a terminal processing lag. This digital fog creates a lethal hesitation where seconds translate into sunken tonnage and a total loss of tactical momentum. If a commander cannot verify a contact with absolute certainty, the entire rules of engagement framework begins to fracture under the weight of potential collateral damage. We are seeing the deliberate exploitation of the very precision that usually makes Western systems invincible. This was a doctrine crisis specifically engineered to paralyze the response. The actual failure was the inability of the automated Aegis combat system to instantly differentiate between a civilian vessel and a Shahed 136 loitering munition as they slipped between civilian radar returns. These drones did not just attack. They integrated themselves into the existing wave clutter and commercial traffic patterns, causing the battle space picture to deteriorate into near-instant confusion. As the situation spiraled, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer was forced to break formation and move directly ahead of the convoy. It was a calculated risk, physically, positioning itself between the incoming swarm and the oil tankers to act as a human-controlled shield. Its Aegis combat system expanded into full-area surveillance mode while the SPY radar continuously scanned the strait, desperately trying to separate civilian maritime traffic from hostile contacts before they closed into engagement range. Radio communications erupted across the coalition fleet as layered defensive corridors rapidly formed around the convoy, but the true threat was not the raw number of Iranian assets. It was the unprecedented speed at which the attack forced the United States defensive network to divide its attention simultaneously across surface targets, low-altitude air threats, and dense civilian traffic. Iran was not merely trying to sink a single ship. It was attempting to overload the escort force's entire decision-making chain before NATO could fully enter the fight and stabilize the strait. As the Iranian swarm successfully forces the United States Navy to divide its attention across three separate combat domains, what secret next layer of response is being held in reserve to prevent the total collapse of the coalition's decision-making chain before NATO can even join the fight? The collapse of a decision-making chain in a high-intensity combat zone is rarely caused by a single weapon, but by the paralyzing weight of conflicting data. When a billion-dollar warship cannot distinguish a civilian trawler from a suicide drone, the entire operational logic of the escort mission dissolves into a state of deep uncertainty. This was not just a technical glitch. It was a profound doctrine crisis where the defenders were forced into a reactive defensive posture. The threat of a massive civilian casualty event or the loss of a supertanker became an immediate paralyzing reality. The coalition was effectively blind in the most critical maritime corridor on Earth, staring into a digital abyss that threatened to consume the entire mission before it truly began. To prevent this total systemic collapse, the United States Navy activated its elite high-altitude maritime the Boeing P-8 Poseidon, at 3:10 a.m. as the Iranian swarm continued pressing against the convoy's defensive perimeter. This next layer of response moved into the northern sector of the Strait of Hormuz, operating from a coalition base deep in the Gulf. The Poseidon immediately deployed a chain of sonobuoys along potential underwater approach corridors. Its ISR system rapidly expanded the wider operational picture, tracking high-speed surface contacts while simultaneously monitoring abnormal movements beneath nearby civilian shipping lanes. Almost immediately, faint subsurface anomalies began forming along the convoy's predicted path. Ghadir-class midget submarines were detected, appearing not as solid contacts but as intermittent acoustic shadows. These vessels were slipping in and out of sonar resolution by exploiting the extreme density of civilian shipping noise and thermal layering beneath the strait. Within minutes, real-time targeting data from the P-8 was transmitted directly to the escorting Arleigh Burke-class destroyer group defending the convoy. Radar sweeps, thermal signatures, and low-altitude contacts were fused into a shared battlespace network. This integration allowed United States crews to finally separate Iranian drone boats from civilian traffic inside the narrow maritime corridor. For a brief moment, the defensive picture began to stabilize as multiple Iranian swarm elements were finally tracked continuously across the strait. Just as the United States Navy successfully fuses its sensor data to unmask the hidden Iranian submarines, what coastal specter is about to be unleashed to fracture the coalition's newly stabilized digital reality and turn their own automated systems against them? In modern naval warfare, the greatest threat is often invisible, residing not in steel hulls but in the electromagnetic spectrum. A stabilized digital reality is a fragile construct, entirely dependent on the seamless flow of data packets between sensors and shooters. When that flow is corrupted, the very technology designed to provide clarity becomes a vector for confusion. The coalition's reliance on automated sensor fusion created a single critical point of failure that an intelligent adversary could exploit with surgical precision. This spectral assault does not destroy the machine. It forces the machine to lie to its operators. By turning their most trusted tools into instruments of deception, the adversary effectively weaponizes the defender's own information architecture. The coastal specter emerged as Iranian electronic warfare units, positioned strategically along the rugged coastline, activated intermittent jamming across multiple sectors of the Strait of Hormuz. These coastal units began probing the spectrum with intermittent jamming bursts, specifically testing for vulnerabilities in the coalition's sensor fusion seams. Rather than committing to a full, continuous block, the Iranians utilized a sophisticated pulsing technique that caused some Boeing P-8 tracks to lag behind real-world movement. Other contacts began to disappear and reappear, offset by several hundred meters from their true positions. This deliberate temporary desynchronization between sensor sources forced United States crews to abandon their high-tech advantages. They were forced into a doctrine crisis, manually verifying targets instead of relying on the automated systems that usually define Western dominance. At 3:15 a.m., the pressure intensified as a second wave of Shahed 136 drones emerged from deep Iranian airspace. Unlike the first wave, these munitions spread into looser, more unpredictable formations. They exploited the burgeoning radar clutter, forcing the coalition to expand its tracking coverage even further and straining the already flickering battle space network to its absolute limit. As the digital network fractures and United States crews are forced to rely on manual verification to distinguish friend from foe, a specific blind gap is the second wave of Shahed drones about to exploit to strike the convoy before the F-35 Lightning II fighters can reconnect the fragmented kill chain. The emergence of a blind gap in a contested maritime corridor is not just a technical failure. It is a strategic invitation for total operational erasure. Manual verification is a desperate, analog solution in a digital war, and it is inherently flawed by human reaction times. As the second wave of drones approached, the escort fleet found itself staring at a radar screen that was effectively lying every shadow on the glass. Could be a civilian vessel or a terminal threat. This is the moment where an asymmetric advantage becomes a lethal trap. The coalition was seconds away from a doctrine crisis that would have seen supertankers burning in the strait. The United States Navy recognized this strategic inflection point and escalated immediately from defensive tracking into full tactical airspace control. They neutralized the blind gap by launching multiple Lockheed Martin F-35C Lightning II fighters from nearby carrier groups to push directly into the engagement zone. These fifth-generation fighters utilized distributed sensor fusion to bypass the Iranian jamming. By networking their own advanced internal sensors, they began to reconnect the fragmented targeting data that had been disrupted by coastal electronic warfare units. As the fighters entered the corridor, the low-flying Shahed 136, drones previously lost in the noise of civilian radar clutter began to appear with lethal clarity on coalition networks. The F-35Cs immediately began degrading the incoming drone formations, picking them off before they could close the distance to the convoy. Once partial tracking stability was restored, these stealth fighters transitioned from simple interception into full airspace control over the entire strait. They were now continuously feeding updated targeting data back to the escort fleet below, effectively acting as the central nervous system for a reviving kill chain. Exploiting this newfound advantage, the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer group shifted into full combat escort mode, launching SM-2 missiles at long-range aerial targets. Simultaneously, the ESSM systems were activated to engage high-speed threats that were already penetrating the outer defensive layer around the convoy. Now that partial tracking stability has been restored, what devastating new layer of electronic warfare is Iran about to unveil that will threaten to sever the data links between the F-35Cs and the fleet below, plunging the convoy back into total darkness? In the high-stakes environment of the Strait of Hormuz, a blind gap is more than a technical glitch. It is a strategic graveyard for maritime dominance. This void in the sensor picture represents the exact moment when technological superiority is neutralized by environmental noise and clever geometry. These gaps are meticulously engineered to create a state of absolute uncertainty, forcing commanders to choose between firing blindly or suffering a terminal impact. If the second wave of munitions successfully occupies this silence, the escort formation ceases to be a shield and becomes a collection of targets. The psychological pressure of this invisibility is intended to shatter the command's composure before the first physical strike even lands. The drones exploited the fragmented targeting data by utilizing looser, unpredictable formations that the coalition's flickering sensors could not maintain as unified tracks. By hiding within the residual radar clutter of civilian shipping, they transformed the maritime corridor into a maze of ghosts. The coalition was forced to expand its tracking coverage so far that the system's processing power reached a terminal limit, leaving the inner defensive layer wide open to a low-altitude breakthrough. At 3:21 a.m., Iran responded with its most intense electronic warfare escalation of the entire battle. Coastal electronic warfare installations expanded from scattered, tactical jamming into massive, wide-area interference across multiple sectors of the strait. This was a deliberate attempt at operational erasure immediately, straining the coalition's integrated sensor network to its breaking point. Data links between the Boeing P-8 Poseidon, the F-35C Lightning II fighters, and the escort destroyers began fragmenting under the sheer pressure of the jamming surge. This was no longer a doctrine crisis of confusion, but a systemic collapse of data integrity. Iranian suicide drones, specifically optimized for radar and sensor hunting, began diving toward the fleet from irregular, unpredictable angles to exploit this digital instability. Target feeds from multiple platforms no longer aligned perfectly, with some tracks lagging behind actual movement while others drifted kilometers away from their true positions. Hostile contacts would vanish from one sensor node only to reappear seconds later on another, creating a phantom-like presence on every screen. This forced coalition crews to manually validate every single target, effectively stripping away the speed of their automated kill chain. For several critical seconds, the entire convoy defense network experienced a total temporary desynchronization. The coalition still possessed overwhelming firepower superiority, but Iran had achieved its primary objective. They had successfully disrupted the rhythm of the United States kill chain at the exact moment the battle was supposed to stabilize. As the coalition's digital reality desynchronizes and the rhythm of the kill chain is shattered at the most critical moment of the battle, what unexpected third-party power is currently accelerating toward the combat zone to attempt a sensor recovery that the United States Navy's own systems are failing to achieve? When the digital reality of a modern carrier strike group desynchronizes, the result is more than just technical static. It is a total collapse of tactical confidence. In this state of electromagnetic decay, the United States Navy was no longer fighting a war of attrition, but a war against its own sensors. The high-stakes danger here is that without a unified battle space picture, the risk of a total doctrine crisis becomes a mathematical certainty. Every second of delay allowed the Iranian swarm to close the distance, turning a sophisticated escort mission into a potential massacre. The coalition needed more than just a reboot. It required an entirely different architectural approach to surveillance that was immune to the specific frequency of the Iranian jamming. This wasn't just a hardware failure, but a strategic vacuum that threatened to achieve an operational erasure of Western maritime dominance in a single hour. This was the strategic inflection point where the asymmetric advantage shifted back to the coastal aggressor. The answer to this systemic paralysis was not found in the United States inventory, but in the surgical arrival of the British Royal Navy. As the American battle network struggled to recover from the electronic warfare surge, a British Type 45 destroyer, which had been holding a rear support position, began accelerating toward the center of the engagement zone. At 3:33 a.m., this vessel pushed fully into the fragmented sensor corridor over the Strait of Hormuz. Its Samson AESA radar was activated, immediately sweeping the entire air and surface picture surrounding the convoy despite the heavy jamming environment, unlike the fragmented tracking feeds spreading across the United States network. The British radar system rebuilt the battle space through multi-source cross-verification. Instead of relying on single-track continuity, it utilized a diverse array of data points to filter out the Iranian noise. Targets that were previously drifting under electronic warfare pressure began to stabilize across every coalition display. Surface contacts were reclassified with surgical precision. Low-flying drones that had vanished into the clutter reappeared with clearer movement vectors. This fresh data continuously fed into the integrated battle space network, causing the newly opened blind zones around the defensive perimeter to gradually shrink. Data links between the Boeing P-8 Poseidon, the Lockheed Martin F-35C Lightning II formations, and United States escort destroyers began resynchronizing, as the Samson radar provided stable tracking across the coalition network. Within minutes, F-35Cs regained solid weapons lock on multiple Shahed 136 drones that had previously disappeared into radar clutter, allowing the coalition to gradually restore a disrupted kill chain. It was a masterclass in sensor recovery, proving that in modern warfare, the ability to see through the fog is more valuable than the weight of the munitions you carry. While the British Samson radar is successfully rebuilding the coalition's digital picture for the first time in minutes, what unseen physical gap has already been opened in the convoy's blind zones that no amount of radar clarity can seal before the remaining suicide drones reach their terminal targets? The internal breach is the most dangerous phase of a doctrine crisis because it bypasses the outer layers of technological deterrence. Even with the Samson radar restoring track continuity, a physical gap had emerged during the temporary desynchronization of the United States kill chain. This was a narrowing window of vulnerability that existed not on a screen but in the physical distance between the tankers and the approaching munitions. No amount of digital clarity can instantly reposition a missile that is out of its engagement envelope. This internal breach was the actual answer to the question of what radar could not seal. It was a failure of physical geometry that the Iranian swarm sought to exploit for a final terminal strike against the supertankers. The unseen physical gap was an internal breach within the coalition's defensive network, where a small group of Iranian suicide drones had already moved within the inner perimeter during the seconds of sensor chaos. The British destroyer immediately transitioned from sensor recovery into direct engagement to address this threat. Its Sea Viper system launched Taster missiles toward multiple aerial targets, exploiting the temporary blind gaps created by Iranian electronic warfare interference. Several drones were destroyed before reaching the outer defensive layer of the convoy, but a small group managed to slip through the narrowing window and close in on the escort formation. This forced an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer to shift into a last-line naval shield posture, maneuvering its hull directly alongside the oil tankers to block any final penetration attempts. For a few tense seconds, the Iranian swarm appeared to have reopened an internal breach inside the coalition defensive network. But then, Sea Viper fired again. Aster missiles surged into the night sky before diving onto the remaining drones, exploiting the last available gap. Each contact vanished from coalition displays, and the breach Iran had tried to force open was fully sealed. By By 3:49 a.m., the battle space began stabilizing again as the coalition sensor network finally achieved a state of structured control. As the coalition sensor network finally stabilizes and the surface breach is fully sealed at 3:49 a.m., what suspicious acoustic signatures are currently being isolated in the northern sector of the strait, and what lethal trap is the P-8 Poseidon about to trigger to end the Iranian submarine threat beneath the convoy? The underwater domain represents the ultimate frontier of an operational erasure. While the surface battle is visible and kinetic, the threat lurking below the thermal layers is far more insidious. These Ghadir-class midget submarines represent a doctrine crisis for traditional blue water navies because they are designed to sit in absolute silence, masking their presence against the deafening roar of civilian shipping traffic. If they are allowed to maneuver into a firing position, the entire escort mission faces a strategic inflection point from which there is no recovery. The tension in the Combat Information Center reaches a peak as the crew realizes that a single torpedo could undo hours of successful air defense. This was the silent pressure axis that Iran hoped would remain unobserved until it was too late. The answer to this subsurface threat arrived from the upper battle space through the methodical deployment of an expanded sonobuoy chain by the Boeing P-8 Poseidon. By 3:49 a.m., as the coalition sensor network finally stabilized, the Poseidon successfully tracked and isolated these suspicious acoustic signatures into narrow corridors. It identified them definitively as Iranian Ghadir-class submarine activity, stripping away their asymmetric advantage and transforming the underwater blind zone into a transparent engagement field. With this discovery, the battle shifted away from emergency defense toward structured battlespace control. The underwater domain was no longer a blind zone, preventing Iran from opening a new pressure axis beneath the convoy while surface combat was still ongoing. On the surface, Arleigh Burke-class destroyer escorts maintained a continuous defensive ring around the supertankers. They engaged drone boats and low-altitude threats that were still attempting to slip through the outer missile layer. Instead of reacting in fragmented bursts under saturation pressure, United States destroyers now operated in tight coordination with the British Type 45 destroyer. This synergy allowed the coalition to dismantle the remaining Iranian swarm layer by layer rather than constantly firefighting across the convoy corridor. Earlier, Iran had forced the coalition to split its attention simultaneously across airborne drones, high-speed surface attacks, electronic warfare, and subsurface threats. Now, the surviving Shahed 136 drones and drone boats appeared only in fragmented clusters. They no longer carried enough density to overwhelm the United States and NATO defense network as they had in the opening phase. As the coalition successfully transitions from emergency defense to a methodical dismantling of the Iranian swarm, what hidden coordination node is still managing the remaining drone clusters from the shadows? And how will the F-35Cs use their restored sensor fusion to hunt it down before the final withdrawal begins? The coordination node is the invisible architect of a swarm attack, the singular point where tactical data becomes lethal action. Without neutralizing these nodes, any victory remains superficial, as the remaining drone clusters can still be rate-asked to exploit the slightest hesitation in the defensive line. These nodes represent the final layer of an asymmetric advantage, allowing a coastal force to manage chaos from a distance and maintain a persistent threat. To leave them active is to invite a renewed doctrine crisis just as the convoy reaches its most vulnerable exit point. The high-stakes danger is that a surviving node could trigger a terminal saturation strike that bypasses the restored sensor network entirely. Achieving true operational erasure requires the systematic decapitation of this command architecture to ensure the enemy's maneuver space remains permanently collapsed. At 4:00 a.m., the Lockheed Martin F-35C Lightning II fighters utilized their restored sensor fusion to pinpoint and guide strike operations directly against these final Iranian swarm coordination nodes. As the fighters pushed deeper into the engagement corridor, the remaining aerial contacts were systematically isolated and neutralized. Simultaneously, the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer escorts launched SM-2 missiles at long-range targets, while ESSM systems continued eliminating drone boats and low-altitude threats that were still attempting to penetrate the inner defensive layer. At the center of this revitalized battle network, the Boeing P-8 Poseidon maintained real-time targeting updates for both United States and British forces. This relentless data flow compressed every remaining Iranian movement into an increasingly confined battle space, leaving the aggressor with no room to maneuver. Iran made a final, desperate attempt to cover its withdrawal using surviving Siraj-1 boats and scattered Shahed 136 drones, hoping to disrupt the pursuing formations and temporarily reopen blind sectors around the convoy. However, the British Type 45 destroyer fully restored its Samson radar and launched another Sea Viper engagement sequence. This final volley destroyed the remaining aerial targets and restored absolute tracking stability across the combined network. As the last remnants of the Iranian swarm were gradually erased from coalition displays, the Iranian offensive collapsed completely, unable to sustain pressure across air, surface, and electronic domains. The aggressor's forces were forced into a chaotic withdrawal as the United States and NATO regained total, uncontested control of the Strait of Hormuz. As the coalition regains total control and the Iranian forces are forced into a chaotic withdrawal, what single, overlooked strategic decision made at the very start of the engagement regarding the timing of electronic warfare actually doomed the entire Iranian operation from the first minute? The timing of electronic interference is the most sensitive variable in any asymmetric maritime offensive. Activating these systems at the wrong moment creates a strategic inflection point that leads directly to operational erasure. If an aggressor pulses the electromagnetic spectrum too early, they surrender the element of surprise and invite a high-intensity counter-escalation from superior forces. If they wait too long, they are detected by long-range surveillance assets and neutralized before they can even bridge the distance to the target. This tactical choice represents a profound doctrine crisis for a coastal power attempting to challenge the technological dominance of a carrier strike group. In the Strait of Hormuz, this single decision dictated the entire rhythm of the engagement and ensured the eventual collapse of the Iranian offensive. The strategic reality is that the decision to activate electronic warfare at the very outset of the attack was the pivot that doomed the Iranian operation to failure. While it provided the temporary cover needed to approach the convoy, it simultaneously authorized the coalition to deploy its most advanced and unbreakable sensor assets to regain control. If Iran had not activated electronic warfare at the outset, the entire dynamic could have shifted in favor of the coalition even earlier, as the Lockheed Martin F-35C Lightning II and Boeing P-8 Poseidon would have maintained perfect, continuous sensor fusion from the first second. This would have enabled coalition forces to detect, classify, and lock the entire swarm at long range before it ever reached the convoy. In that alternative scenario, Arleigh Burke-class destroyers could have shifted immediately to Tomahawk strikes against coastal launch sites, erasing the threat before the first drone never reached the shipping lanes. By forcing a struggle for the digital environment, Iran inadvertently proved a fundamental truth of modern warfare. The outcome is not determined by the number of weapons fired, but by who controls the battle space. While the British Type 45 destroyer provided the final stabilization required to secure the Strait of Hormuz, the engagement serves as a definitive case study in data integrity as a weapon system. The coalition did not just win a battle of attrition. They achieved a total operational erasure of the opponent's tactical options. If the outcome of a modern conflict is ultimately not determined by the number of weapons fired but by who controls the digital battle space, what specific next-generation black box technology is currently being deployed to ensure that NATO's sensor fusion remains unbreakable in the face of the next, even more advanced electronic warfare surge?